I am really pleased and honored to be a speaker this afternoon at CHA. I am a sociologist by training, and I'm an environmental sociologist. And I'm proud to say that I am an environmentalist. For the last 4 decades, I have tried to connect the dots. All of the work that I've done in my academic career has focused on building health in everything. So, the presentation this afternoon is the quest for environmental and climate justice. And the theme of this year's assembly hits at home: renew, reimagine, rejoice. And I think the essence of Pope Francis' Laudato Si requires urgent response to the issues that we face today. A moral and spiritual challenge, care for God's creation. We are all connected. The impact of all of the things that are happening to poor and the call for solidarity. My job is to connect the dots in 30 minutes. And I'm good at it, believe it or not. I've written 18 books over the last 4 decades. I like to write. And it's 18 books, but it's just one book, but don't tell anybody. Housing, transportation, energy, food and water security, land use, smart growth, disaster response. My last book was called The Wrong Complexion for Protection. Deals with disaster. 8 decades of disasters, and the question is, has the government responded equally and fairly to all communities? 300 pages, NYU Press book, 300 pages. And the short answer is no. So, how do we define the environment? The environment is everything. It's where we live, work, play, learn, worship, as well as the physical and natural world. And that when we talk about environmental justice, we're talking about every community, every population has a right to equal protection of our environmental, housing, health, transportation, civil rights and human rights laws and regulations. In the real world, there are some communities that are physically located on the wrong side of the tracks, or the wrong side of the levee, on the wrong side of the road, the river, that oftentimes will place them at greater risk from hazards, dangers, and etc. In some cases, zip code is still the most potent predictor of health and well-being. You tell me your zip code, I can tell you what's in that zip code that will make you a greater probability that you'll be healthy, and what's in that community that could somehow diminish health. So when we talk about this whole question of the environment, and we talk about justice, America is segregated, and so is pollution. Do I need to repeat that? I will. America is segregated, and so is pollution. I found this out 42 years ago. And there are no studies on this. The study that I did on a lawsuit, Bean versus Southwestern Waste Management Corporation, I was asked by my wife one day. She came home and said, "Bob, I've just sued the state of Texas Department of Health." I said, "You did what?" Now, I worked for a state university. This is 1976. So technically, she sued my employer. I said, "What?" Okay. She said, "I need somebody to collect data for my lawsuit and find out where all the landfills, incinerators, garbage dumps, toxic waste sites, et cetera, are located in Houston, and put it on a map so I can go into court, because I just filed a temporary restraining order, and I have to go into court in 10 days. I said, "You need a sociologist." She said, "That's what you are, right?" So in research, we call that serendipity. I call it, what? So I said, I said, "That's a lot of work. And do you have a budget? You have a grant?" She said, "No." She said, "You got to do it." And I thought about it. Then she said, you all I got. Now, what can you say? Well, I had 10 students in my research methods class. I told at Texas Southern University, where I am now, I told my students, we have a research project. And anytime a professor tells a student they have a research project, really the students got to say, oh, Dr. Bullard, we got a research project. Our project was to put on a map where all the landfills are located, incinerators, garbage dumps, and then find out who lives around that and to go into court. Now, this is before there was no Google, iPad, GIS. There was none of that. It was like ancient. This is 1978, 79. And it was like you got a hammer and a chisel trying to figure out what's going on. And so it was like I was sociologist as detective. That was the first lawsuit challenging environmental discrimination used in civil rights law, Bean versus Southwestern Waste Management Corporation. And what we found was amazing. 82% of all the garbage disposed in Houston from the 30s up to 1978 was being disposed in predominantly black neighborhoods in Houston. Now, when I say predominantly black neighborhoods, that's like me saying my family is predominantly black. These are all black neighborhoods in Houston. How do we know Jim Crow segregation did it? 5 out of 5 of the city-owned landfills, 6 out of 8 of the city-owned incinerators, 3 out of 4 of the privately-owned landfills, 82% of all the garbage going into a community that's only 25% of the population. That was an aha moment for me, and that sent me on a 42-year journey that I'm still working on right now. We lost that lawsuit because we could not prove intentional discrimination in the 4th largest city that doesn't have zoning. Somebody decided that black communities were compatible with garbage. This was not the Northeast Houston neighborhood that was subject of this landfill, was not a poverty pocket, was not a ghetto. Black middle-class homeowners in the suburbs, nothing out there but trees, houses, and black people. Now, that was a discovery 42 years ago. I wrote a book in 1990 called Dumping in Dixie. That was the first environmental justice book. That book's almost 32 years old. And it took me a year to publish that book because publishers were saying there's no such thing as environmental racism, there's no such thing as environmental justice because the environment is neutral. Everybody is treated the same in the environment. Everybody has the same access, et cetera. And it took me a whole year to get that book published. And it finally got published in Westview Press, a publisher in Boulder, Colorado. Anybody from Boulder, Colorado? Westview Press, Mountain High Air, bean sprouts, tofu, marijuana. They decided to publish my book. And Westview made it a textbook. It got adopted at universities, and when a book is a required text, students have to buy it. That's how it got in. Understand that there's an unequal burden of pollution on poor people and people of color. 40% of Americans right now live in what's called non-attainment areas that have bad air. Non-attainment, that's like saying bad air. You have not achieved the standards in terms of having air quality that's above the standards. That's 40%. That's a lot of people living, 135 million people. Big problem. But if you go from 30,000 feet and go to ground zero, 61% people of color, 61% more likely to live in these non-attainment areas, these places where the air is not meeting the standards. And so when you talk about this unequal burden, there's an unequal burden of living in those places with bad air, but that's also an unequal burden of bad health outcomes, asthma, respiratory, cardiovascular. You start naming all those diseases, and they show up. These are not mysteries. It's not rocket science. Unequal air, in terms of EPA study, found that in 46 states, this pattern occurs where people of color are more likely to breathe dirty air than whites. People of color face more sources of bad pollution, not just pollution from trucks and diesels and you name it, refineries, but people are more likely to be subjected to multiple sources of pollution, and poor people. So when we talk about pollution and the most impacted and the most vulnerable, who do you think? People who can't vote? People who are not old enough to protest? Children. And children are not little adults. When we talk about this pollution problem and the concentration of the problem of bad air, not having access to the kinds of things that can make a community much more resilient, you can see it showing up in these asthma rates. For example, African American children have an asthma death rate that's 8 times that of white children. This is unacceptable for any children to have high asthma rates when we're talking about the physical environment, the built environment, and lack of kinds of land uses that would somehow filter communities away from these dangerous facilities. Particulate matter, for example. People of color are more likely to live in neighborhoods with more PM 2.5. PM 2.5 is just soot, small particles, diesel, trains, you name it, refineries, small dust particles, that kind of thing. And Harvard did a study in 2020, found that communities that are inundated with high levels of PM 2.5 are 8% more likely to die from asthma. I'm sorry, we knew that with asthma, but here with COVID, with this new respiratory illness that's attacking us. So if you already live in a polluted area, and then this coronavirus hits, it acted like a heat-seeking missile that sought out the most vulnerable population in terms of the pollution, and you saw these death bombs, death rates exploding with this heat-seeking missile called COVID. And people were asking, well, why is it that all these people are dying from COVID in these places that's high pollution? Make the connection. But the idea, even before COVID, we had these high illnesses in terms of respiratory illnesses and cardiovascular. Climate change will exacerbate these health disparities that we already know that we've been fighting many years. And so when we talk about climate change as a health threat, that we must have health professionals and others on point to talk about the impacts of climate change and the impact that it will have or is having on health. And when we talk about this whole question of it will exacerbate health disparities as we map across the country, we know that there are certain areas that are better off when we talk about the healthiest states. Climate change will impact every state and different impacts. And when we talk about the West, we're talking wildfires, we're talking droughts, heat waves, et cetera. Where I live in Houston, the Gulf Coast, we're talking hurricanes. As a matter of fact, in the Gulf Coast right now, Alex is bringing water to Florida, and Miami is some of the streets are flooding. So when we talk about these impacts, there's no area that's immune for these. So what we talk about the justice part is how does vulnerability and marginalized communities deal with these threats when they're already stressed by not having certain types of infrastructure, good transportation, access to health care, not having the kinds of parks, green space, healthy grocery stores, et cetera. We know all these things because you're health professionals. Health is in everything. So it means that we have to look at these issues as justice questions, and we have to talk about equity, inequality, and look at climate change as a justice issue through that lens. Climate change will hit the poorest region of the country and the poorest people. And if we draw a horizontal line across the United States, upper half, lower half, upper half will, in terms of economics, and I don't think I included a map that had the zip code by economics, but just imagine upper half, lower half, and you draw a line across the U.S. horizontal, and you make the upper half yellow, which is prosperous, and as you start moving from yellow to brown, brown will be less prosperous, distress. You'll find that map will be consistent across the board in terms of poverty and other kinds of vulnerabilities. This map, if you can see it, shows if we do nothing or do little in addressing climate change, the poorest region of the country will get hit the hardest. The United States will lose 1.2 drop in GDP if we do nothing or little. The southern United States could lose up to a 20% drop in GDP. The southern United States is already, that bottom half of the country is already poor economically in terms of zip codes. Here's a map that's showing the areas that will lose the greatest drop in GDP. That's the dark brown. The blue represents the areas that will lose the least. So when we talk about regional, we talk about economic, we talk about racial, climate change will widen the racial income gap. For example, there's a study that was done in 2018 by Rice University and folks at University of Pittsburgh showed that after these $10 billion severe weather events, hurricanes and other kinds of events, when federal dollars go in for making these communities whole, white communities on average end up $120,000 in wealth increase after the recovery dollars go in. In other words, if you got an $800,000 home and you have repairs and retrofits after recovery, $200,000 go into retrofit, that's $1 million home now. But communities of color end up $29,000 worse off. How did that happen? Cost-benefit analysis. The formula is money follows money, money follows power, money follows whites. What it means is that cost-benefit analysis will reward structural inequality and keep making the inequality worse unless we use other metrics. The EPA found that climate change will hit people of color hardest in a number of areas: flooding, in terms of droughts, in terms of areas, in terms of worsened air quality, in terms of heat waves. So that means that we have to not see climate change as something that will hit everybody the same, and so one size does not fit all. We have to start looking at the vulnerability, and as a matter of fact, CDC developed the Social Vulnerability Index, SVI, that FEMA is beginning to use with some of its programs to supplement and complement the cost-benefit analysis. Because if you're just sending money to the $800,000 homes on the west side and $80,000 on the east side that's got just as much damage, but if you cost it out and you talk about return on investments, the $80,000 homes on the east side are not going to get a dime. So the idea is that some communities have the wrong complexion for protection. That's what I told you about, a 300-page book, and the conclusion was, will the government response to climate change be fair? Answer, no, not unless we force it to do. And so when we talk about redlining and policies, redlining that occurred 100 years ago, redlining was nothing more than a form of discrimination where insurance companies, mortgage companies, banks basically drew a line around black and communities of color and said no loan, no infrastructure, and they were redlined. The green lines were the areas that got the loans and the money. That's 100 years ago, in the 1920s. Even the 2020s now showing that the neighborhoods that were redlined 100 years ago are the areas that are more prone to flooding today. They have more pollution. They are hotter, urban heat islands, and they tend to have more COVID because of pollution. Climate change and flooding will more likely impact those neighborhoods that have higher percentage of black people in the South or in the Gulf Coast. Climate change flooding will increase 25% in the next 30 years for the country at large, as a whole. But for those counties and places that have larger black population in the South, 20% or more, those areas will have flooding that will increase 40%. So you're talking about going into the future, areas that have historically been discriminated against, place, will even have further disadvantages. And this is a map that shows the darker the blue, the more the flooding that will occur. And again, you can see those where the blue is and where the green is. As you start going interior, you find less flooding. You'll also have the impact on flood insurance. And if you look at the red is where the flood insurance is increased the greatest. And here's a map that shows of the 10 states with the highest flood insurance premium increase, 7 out of 10 of those are in the South, the poorest places with the greatest risk. Who gets federal disaster aid and who gets left behind? Not rocket science. Here's a FEMA study showed that FEMA aid is not reaching those of greatest need. FEMA's programs that historically have used cost-benefit analysis have skirted over low-income communities, working-class communities, and left those behind. Disaster buyouts is a program where counties get together and decide where the greatest risks are, and homeowners, et cetera, and where buyouts are going to occur. Disaster buyouts tend to favor white middle-class households, homeowners. FEMA buyouts were in neighborhoods 85% or more non-Hispanic whites. When that's overrepresentation of the buyouts, when whites make up about 62% of the U.S. population. Climate change will make for hotter days. Heat is the #1 killer when it comes to weather-related, not drowning. Heat stress is also, there's a racial lens in heat stress in terms of who's most likely to be sent to the hospital for heat stress, heat stroke. And a lot has to do with people not having adequate air conditioning, people who work outside, lots of factors. But again, there's a vulnerability there. Urban heat islands occur in cities where there are no trees, and we talk about too hot to learn. A lot of our schools are in urban heat islands. They're in areas that are, when it gets too hot to learn, a lot of our schools don't have AC. So it means that climate change is an educational issue. It's a justice issue. It's an economic issue. When it gets too hot to work outside, and if you look at the labor force, who's working outside, you don't have to have a Ph.D. or M.D. to know who has those jobs. And again, an outdoor worker is 38% more likely to die from exposure to heat than other workers. And we talk about too hot to work outside, it means that will impact that workforce in terms of their earning capacity. So when we talk about these issues, we have to look at it from a justice frame. Climate change will strand more Americans in what's called nature-deprived neighborhoods where there's no green space, et cetera. Even right now, 74% of people of color live in what's called nature-deprived neighborhoods compared to 23% of whites. Rich Americans enjoy almost 50% more trees or greenery than poor Americans. These are statistics that you ask the average person, they could tell you, no, we ain't got no damn trees. It's barren over here. But this has implications for health. Going into the future, climate change will, in terms of loss of land cover, will disproportionately impact people of color greater. So that means that it's a civil rights, economic, health, land use issue. If we look at who has trees and who doesn't, not rocket science. So having trees in the neighborhoods can have economic benefits, but also health benefits. We know it's cooler where there are trees. I mean, we've known that for lots of years. So climate change will cause more grid failure and stranding people without power, heat, drinking water. We had a power outage last year in Houston or in Texas because we like a whole country. We're not even connected to the rest of the country. And Winter Storm Uri hit in February, and everything was off. People who are on some type of medical device that needs electricity disproportionately will get hit. And so when we talk about these issues, these are real issues. Grid failure, we're talking about energy insecurity, high price of energy, disproportionately impact low-income families, marginal families who have incomes, they don't have a lot of leeway in terms of discretionary income. Right now, Black, Hispanic, Native American households have greater energy insecurity or energy poverty. When we talk about this, climate change will increase that unless we start addressing these issues fairly and equitable. Here's a map showing the darker the brown area represents households that pay 19% or more of their household budget on utilities. Now this is old. This map is old. This map is like about 3-4 years old. But even now, the numbers are going up because if you live in a house or apartment and your utilities are going up and they've gone up 30%, your income has not gone up 30%. But if you have a nice income, it doesn't hit you the same. So the disproportionality is real in terms of this. Here's a map showing the average monthly cost of utilities. This map is 2 years old. It's old, given what we have to pay now. But if you look at the darker the green, the higher the energy cost. And in this map, the darkest the green represents average of $500 a month on utilities. Once again, you start mapping this out, and it's the same map in terms of where people live and how much access they have to green space, how much they have access to the kinds of policies and programs at the state level to address energy insecurity or energy poverty, to address issues around trying to get more affordable, accessible alternatives to driving, transportation, like public transportation, et cetera. And so the idea is, how do we build justice into our sustainability, our resilience plans, our climate action plans, our health equity plans? That means that we have to think and plan for doing it. It just doesn't happen. I mean, I looked at, climate resilience plans across the country, and 3 or 4 years ago, they were written by a few people in a room, no interaction with communities, environmental justice communities, climate justice communities, communities of color. And that has changed. And so when we talk about sustainability, we talk about just sustainability. This is a book that a colleague and I wrote coming out of the World Summit on Sustainability. We said just sustainability. We have to address issues, not just sustainable in a way that people talk about it in a textbook way. We have to address energy, food, and water insecurity, equitable development, families below poverty, health, income, and wealth gap, resilient communities. We have to talk about bringing in the justice issues into all of that. I serve on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council that President Biden appointed, 26 members. And there's an initiative that he's underway. It's called Justice 40. And this initiative basically talks about, as we move toward a clean energy economy, that 40% of the benefits would go to those communities that historically have been left behind. They're calling them disadvantaged communities, but for the last 40 years, we call them environmental justice communities, underserved communities, 40% of the benefits. So that means that we have to work to make sure, come up with the tools, the mechanisms, and the metrics to ensure that the money, the benefits, and investments are going to where it needs. And that program, as I said before, is being rolled out as we speak. The bipartisan infrastructure law, $1.5 trillion, trillion with a T, now has the opportunity to do some legacy retrofits, go back and fix things that historically have been broken. But we have to work on it. If we don't work on it, we will reproduce the inequality and allow our country to become much more unequal, unfair, and unjust. We cannot allow that to happen. We need everybody working on this together. I am optimistic, and I think we can do this together. Thank you very much.